Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. Alien professor challenges class. Human solves meteorite problem in seconds. The Galactic Academy's grand lecture hall stretched beyond the limits of the human eye, built from a blend of organic and artificial materials. The towering arches shimmered with pulsating blue light, reacting to the emotions of the gathered students. Some of the brightest minds from across the universe sat in rows of floating seats, their various appendages, tentacles, and bioluminescent skin patterns shifting in anticipation. Today was not just another lecture. It was the beginning of the Academy's most prestigious test, one that separated the brilliant from the exceptional. Professor Exor stood at the center of the massive hall, his elongated frame draped in dark crimson robes woven with microscopic data streams. His species, the Zeph, had been known for their unparalleled intellectual prowess, and he had spent centuries perfecting his teaching methods. With two pairs of glowing pupils scanning the room, he raised a single clawed hand, signaling silence. The whispers of excitement faded instantly. Today, his voice reverberated with an artificial crispness, transmitted directly into the neural receptors of every student. You will face a challenge that will test not only your computational ability, but your understanding of the very fabric of reality. A holographic projection materialized above him, displaying a massive celestial body hurling through space. Its trajectory was chaotic, disrupted by gravitational distortions from a nearby pulsar and the erratic drift of a gas giant's orbit. The meteor's surface was jagged and unstable, shifting under the force of external pressures. Even the smallest miscalculation could send it spiraling into unexpected paths. This meteor, designated RX-9, is currently on an unknown course toward an uncharted planetary system. Your task is simple: calculate its exact point of impact and the precise time it will make contact with the planetary surface. The moment the words left his lips, murmurs spread through the hall. Every student knew the complexity of such a problem. The meteor's erratic movement meant conventional equations would be insufficient. It required advanced gravitational modeling, dark matter interference calculation, and quantum trajectory predictions. The Academy's brightest minds had already attempted to solve similar problems with years of computational power, and now it was being posed as a timed challenge. Gary Newman, the only human in the class, leaned back in his seat, his hands resting on the desk before him. His peers never let him forget that he came from a so-called death world, a planet teeming with chaos, unpredictability, and biological anomalies that defied reason. While other species had evolved in structured environments where logic and order ruled, humanity had thrived in disorder, adapting to uncertainty with instinct rather than pure calculation. The student seated next to him, a four-eyed Claren with translucent blue skin, let out a chittering laugh. This should be entertaining. Your species lacks neural synchronization with computational grids. How do you intend to solve a problem like this, Gary? By guessing. Gary didn't respond. He wasn't here to prove himself with words. His method had always been simple: watch, assess, and act. Professor Exilor raised a hand once more. You will each have access to the Academy's neural computing interface, capable of running multi-end calculations at speeds beyond organic comprehension. You may utilize any theoretical models at your disposal. You have 3 hours. Begin immediately. Alien students activated their neural links, their eyes glowing as they connected with their respective computational systems. Some species used external devices, while others had bioengineered implants that allowed seamless integration with data processors. Within seconds, the hall was alive with streams of cascading numbers and shifting equations appearing in midair, forming intricate three-dimensional models of the meteor's path. Gary, however, did none of this. Instead, he pulled out a simple notepad and a pen. The room fell silent for a moment as students noticed his archaic approach. Some chuckled, others whispered in disbelief. Even Professor Exor's otherwise expressionless face flickered with something resembling amusement. The Claren beside him let out a clicking sound. You can't be serious. You're not even using the neural grid. How do you expect to calculate the gravitational distortions, let alone account for the pulsar's irregular emissions? Gary ignored him. He tapped his pen against the edge of the notepad, watching the holographic projection with calm, focused eyes. His peers were overwhelmed with equations, their minds drowning in a sea of raw data. Gary, on the other hand, had been trained by a different kind of teacher, Earth itself. Where others saw complexity, he saw patterns. His fingers traced the lines of the meteor's trajectory in the air, following its movement as if sketching a path through memory. He didn't need a quantum processor to tell him what he already understood instinctively. Objects followed natural rhythms, the way a baseball curved through the air when thrown at high speed, the way a river's current bent around rocks, the way a tree swayed moments before a gust of wind. Everything followed an unspoken rule of motion. Time passed, and the other students remained lost in their calculations. Their processors ran predictive models that constantly contradicted one another. The pulsar's radiation caused interference, forcing recalculations. The gravitational waves shifted minutely, distorting results. Gary finally picked up his pen and began writing. He didn't use equations as his classmates did. Instead, he relied on simple physics, sketching out an intuitive representation of forces at play. A rough line to represent momentum, small arcs to indicate gravitational influence, a few quick estimations to gauge speed based on observed distance traveled. He didn't need 10,000 formulas, he needed understanding. Professor Xylor observed him with intrigue. Among all his students, only Gary appeared completely at ease. There was no frustration, no panic, no reliance on technology. The timer continued counting down. 3 hours were given, but Gary had already finished in the first 45 minutes. He placed his pen down, exhaled slowly, and looked up across the hall. His peers were still submerged in their numbers, their eyes flickering with the glow of neural interfaces, trying to process ever-changing variables. Gary sat back, watching them struggle. He had his answer now, he just had to wait and see who else would figure it out before time ran out. He already knew the answer. The question was, would anyone else? The timer continued its silent countdown, glowing softly in the dimly lit hall. The other students remained locked in their calculations, their minds tethered to the Academy's quantum processing grids. Data streams flickered across their floating holographic screens, formulas constantly adjusting, variables shifting as new gravitational anomalies were introduced into their models. The meteor's trajectory was anything but straightforward, and the more the alien students tried to refine their calculations, the more complex the problem became. Professor Xylor moved quietly through the room, his long, flowing robes trailing behind him. His 4 eyes flickered between the holographic displays, observing the various approaches each student had taken. Some worked with advanced predictive algorithms, adjusting their formulas with each new distortion detected in the meteor's course. Others had broken the problem into smaller components, isolating gravitational influences and running them through different simulations before attempting to combine their results. The complexity of their methods was impressive, yet none of them had reached a conclusive answer. Gary remained still in his seat, his arms folded across his chest. His notepad sat closed on the desk before him, his pen resting neatly beside it. His work was done, but he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him. The Clarion beside him kept glancing over, his translucent blue fingers twitching as he tried to focus on his own calculations. There was an unspoken tension in the air. How could a human be so calm when no one else had found a solution? The murmurs started again, spreading like an unseen ripple across the room. The students had noticed Gary hadn't touched his work for nearly an hour, yet he remained utterly unconcerned. Some of them assumed he had given up, others weren't so sure. Professor Xylor finally stopped at the center of the hall, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the quiet hum of processing machines. "You are all running out of time. If you do not submit a viable answer before the deadline, you will receive no credit for this challenge." There was a renewed urgency in the room. The alien students increased the speed of their calculations, pushing their quantum interfaces to maximum capacity. The holographic models grew more detailed, some flickering under the strain of rapid adjustments. The numbers kept shifting, solutions appearing and disappearing just as quickly. Even the most advanced minds in the room were struggling to stabilize their predictions. Gary exhaled slowly. He had seen this happen before, not with meteors but with people. pilots who overcompensated for wind resistance and sent their aircraft into dangerous spirals, engineers who adjusted calculations so many times that they lost sight of the original problem. The more someone second-guessed an answer, the further they drifted from the truth. The Claren beside him let out a frustrated hiss, his fingers flicking rapidly across the interface. His calculations were looping back on themselves. Every time he accounted for the gravitational interference, a new variable disrupted the equation. The pulsar was too unpredictable. Its emissions fluctuated in irregular bursts, distorting space around the meteor in ways that couldn't be fully modeled. No matter how precise the adjustments were, the answer refused to settle. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath. "The data is unstable." Gary leaned slightly toward him, his voice casual. "What if you're looking at it wrong?" The Clarion stiffened. He turned his four eyes toward Gary, his expression a mixture of frustration and curiosity. "What do you mean?" Gary gestured lazily toward the holographic projection. "You're treating the meteor's movement like a fixed problem, something that can be solved with pure computation. But space isn't predictable. It doesn't follow strict equations, not when you introduce factors like radiation bursts and gravitational shifts. You're trying to force the data to fit a model instead of understanding the rhythm behind it." The Claren narrowed his eyes. "And you think you've understood it?" His voice was filled with skepticism. Gary smirked slightly. "I'm not thinking about it. I just watched and followed what it was already doing." Professor Exor's gaze flickered toward them. He had been listening. The Claren hesitated, his fingers hovering over his interface. There was something deeply unsettling about the human's confidence. No neural processor, no quantum modeling, just a notepad and a pen. It defied all logic, and yet there Gary sat, completely unbothered by the chaos around him. Another voice spoke from across the hall. A tall, insectoid student with iridescent chitin clicked his mandibles, his multiple limbs working frantically as he recalculated his projections. "Professor, the pulsar's emissions have caused another deviation. The original calculations are invalid." Professor Exilor turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "And what do you propose?" The insectoid's mandibles clicked again. "A complete recalibration. We need more time." The professor's eyes glowed faintly. "Time is the one luxury you do not have." Another murmur spread through the room. The students were beginning to panic. If the most advanced minds in the academy couldn't stabilize the data, what chance did any of them have? Even those who had been confident at the start now looked uncertain. Gary remained silent, watching. He had seen what he needed to see. The others would keep chasing an answer that would never fully settle, not until the meteor had already made impact. But by then, it would be too late. Professor Exor studied the faces of his students, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze settled on Gary. "You have not used the computational grid," he stated. Gary met his gaze. "Didn't need to." The professor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then you claim to have an answer." Gary nodded. "Had it an hour ago." A hush fell over the room. The other students stopped their work, turning toward the human. Even those who had dismissed him before now watched with newfound curiosity. The Clarion beside him let out a sharp breath. "You're bluffing." Gary smirked. "Guess we'll see." The final moments of the countdown ticked away. The holographic screens flickered, displaying incomplete calculations. The alien students had pushed their computational power to its limits, but the problem remained unsolved. Professor Exor raised a hand and the projections disappeared. "Time is up." The students hesitated, their uncertainty evident. Many of them had no final answer to submit. Those who did looked doubtful, knowing that their results were riddled with errors. Professor Xylor turned toward Gary. "You claim to have found a solution. Present it." Gary reached for his notepad, flipping it open to the page he had written on earlier. He held it up casually. The answer was scrawled in clear, simple handwriting. The precise coordinates of impact, the exact time down to the second. The room was silent. Professor Zill's gaze flickered over the numbers. For the first time in centuries, his expression shifted. It was the correct answer. Professor Zyor remained motionless, his glowing eyes fixed on the numbers scrawled across Gary's notepad. The silent hum of the Academy's systems, once a constant backdrop to the student work, now felt deafening in the sudden stillness of the hall. The other students, whose faces ranged from disbelief to barely concealed irritation, waited for the professor to speak. He did not. Instead, the professor slowly extended one clawed hand, his long fingers hovering over Gary's notepad without touching it, as if the very presence of such a crude analog tool was something that defied reason. His mind processed the numbers, cross-referencing them against his internal calculations, against every predictive model he had ever studied. The conclusion was undeniable. Gary Newman, a human without neural augmentation, without a computational grid, had produced an answer that was flawless. The Claren beside him inhaled sharply, his translucent fingers curling against the edge of his desk. His multiple eyes darted back and forth between the professor and Gary, struggling to reconcile what he was seeing. He had spent the last 3 hours in battle with an equation that refused to be tamed, recalculating, adjusting over and over again until the data itself seemed to mock him. And yet this human, this unaugmented anomaly, had been done for more than an hour. Finally, Professor Exor straightened, his towering frame shifting as his robes rippled like liquid metal. His voice, when it came, was softer than before but carried a weight that made the very air in the room feel heavier. "You are correct." The words sent another ripple through the hall, though this one was not of whispers but of stunned silence. There had been no hesitation in the professor's voice, no room for interpretation. The answer was correct beyond any margin of error. Gary, leaning back slightly in his chair, exhaled through his nose and tilted his head. "Yeah, I figured." The Claren flinched. A few others bristled. Even the insected student who had spent hours working through predictive models clicked his mandibles in agitation. The arrogance of the statement, the complete lack of humility, it was infuriating, and yet it was impossible to refute. One of the other students, a tall, silver-skinned being with 6 fingers on each hand, finally broke the silence. His voice was smooth, refined, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "How?" Gary shrugged. "I watched, I thought I solved it." The silver-skinned student's brow furrowed. "You're telling me that you, without a neural processor, without even a basic computational grid, simply observed a problem so complex that it required the combined processing power of an entire academy's worth of quantum systems, and solved it?" Gary glanced at the professor, then back at the student. "Pretty much." The tension in the room thickened. It wasn't just disbelief anymore. It was something else. Frustration, confusion, a sense of inferiority that none of these students, some of whom had spent their entire lives being told they were the best, had ever felt before. Professor Exor clasped his hands behind his back. "Explain your reasoning." Gary tapped his fingers against the desk. "You all focused on the calculations, which makes sense. You relied on equations, models, simulations. The problem is, space isn't as rigid as equations make it seem. The pulsar's emissions, the gravitational shifts, they aren't errors in the equation. They're part of the equation. The more you try to filter them out, the more you miss what's actually happening." His gaze swept across the room. "I didn't try to force the data to fit into a prediction model. I just watched how the meteor was already moving. It wasn't random. It was following a pattern, even if it looked unstable at first. Pulsars pulse at set intervals. Gravitational distortions don't just appear and disappear without cause. Once I saw the rhythm, the rest was easy." The silver-skinned student's expression darkened. "You're saying you solved an advanced astrophysical equation, one that our processors struggled with by intuition." Gary smirked. "I wouldn't call it that, more like pattern recognition." Professor Xylor tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And you believe this pattern recognition is superior to our computational methods?" Gary shrugged again. "Not always, but in this case, yeah. Computers work great until they get stuck in a feedback loop. You all spent 3 hours refining an answer that kept changing because you were looking for certainty in a system that doesn't have it. Space doesn't follow a clean equation. It shifts, it adapts, it responds to outside forces. You don't predict it with absolute numbers. You predict it by understanding its flow." The Clarion, who had been silent until now, let out a sharp exhale. "That's ridiculous." Gary arched an eyebrow. "Is it?" He gestured toward the professor. He just said I was right. Professor Exilor remained still, observing the reactions of his students. He could see the disbelief, the frustration, the resentment. He had expected as much. It was not often that a lifetime of intellectual supremacy was called into question so thoroughly. Finally, he spoke. The results of this challenge have provided expected insight. His gaze shifted slightly, lingering on Gary before sweeping across the rest of the students. I expect you all to reflect on today's outcome. Dismissed. The students hesitated, as if waiting for him to say something more. When he did not, they began gathering their belongings. The murmurs returned, though they were quieter now, more subdued. The Clarin shot one last glare at Gary before storming out. The insectoid clicked his mandibles and followed. Gary, however, remained seated. He watched as Professor Exilor turned, his robes gliding across the floor as he began walking toward the exit. Just before he reached the door, the professor stopped. Without turning around, he spoke, "Walk with me." Gary hesitated for only a moment before rising to his feet. He followed the professor out of the hall, the murmurs of the other students fatting behind him. Something told him this conversation was far from over. Gary followed Professor Exilor through the towering halls of the Galactic Academy, the silence between them stretching long and unbroken. The corridors pulsed with dim blue light, a rhythmic glow embedded into the very architecture of the structure. Each step the professor took was precise, his robes flowing behind him like liquid shadow, while Gary walked with his usual easy stride, hands in his pockets, as if he had not just dismantled the confidence of an entire class filled with the brightest minds in the galaxy. The deeper they moved into the academy, the fewer students they encountered. The passageways became more refined, the ambient hum of technology more subtle. Gary noticed the shift. They were leaving the common areas, venturing into sections of the academy where only a select few were permitted. He didn't ask where they were going. He had the distinct feeling the professor would tell him when he was ready. Finally, after what felt like an intentional stretch of time meant to test his patience, Exor stopped before a large doorway. Unlike the smooth, semi-transparent entrances Gary had seen before, this one was solid and opaque, adorned with intricate symbols that seemed to shift under the low light. Without a word, the professor raised one long, clawed hand, pressing his palm against the center. A soft pulse spread outward, followed by a faint chime. The door slid open, revealing a vast chamber beyond. Gary stepped inside behind him, taking in his surroundings. The room was unlike any part of the academy he had seen before. It was circular, the walls lined with what appeared to be endless streams of data flickering in vertical lines of shifting alien script. At the center of the chamber was a raised platform, a single seat positioned before an array of floating interfaces. The entire space radiated an energy that felt ancient yet hyper-advanced, as if it existed outside the constraints of time itself. The door closed behind them with a quiet hiss. Professor Xylor finally turned to face Gary, his glowing eyes unreadable. "Do you understand where you are?" Gary exhaled, glancing around once more. "Some kind of control center." Exur studied him for a moment before responding. "This is the core chamber. It is the heart of the academy where the highest levels of computational thought are conducted. The answers to questions that have eluded civilizations for millennia are sought here." Gary crossed his arms. "And why am I here?" The professor took a slow step forward, his hands folding behind his back. "Because your answer was not an accident. You demonstrated something that defies our conventional understanding of problem-solving." Gary tilted his head. "You're saying no one else has ever done what I just did?" Exor's gaze didn't waver. "Not in the way you did it." Gary frowned slightly. He knew he had outperformed the other students, but the way the professor spoke, there was something deeper to this, something beyond just a test. The professor continued, "The Galactic Academy is home to species who have spent thousands of years perfecting their intellectual and computational abilities. The challenge I presented today was not designed to be solved by one mind alone. It was meant to test the limitations of even the most advanced students. The data was intentionally unstable. The variables were meant to outpace even the fastest processors." Gary raised an eyebrow. And yet I still got the right answer. Exile Lore inclined his head slightly. Yes, and that is what concerns me. Gary let out a quiet chuckle. Concerns you. The professor didn't react. Your method bypassed the very foundation upon which this institution was built.